Great. So we have a couple of people joining in. I'll just keep an eye on the attendees list there for a while to see if the people have time. For the ones that are dropping in or coming in, just want to welcome you to this webinar regarding, well, not UK surrogacy, I almost misspoke, US surrogacy for UK intended parents, which is a fun long sentence. So we're going to give people just a minute or two to drop in because you know how Zooms and all of this is. It never works for me when I need it to, and it always works when I don't need it to, it seems. So we're just going to give people a couple of minutes to get in here. And while they do that, for the ones that are here, I just want to tell you a little bit about this Zoom webinar kind of style. So there is a possibility to ask questions. There's a Q&A button somewhere on your screen, depending on if you're on a computer, a phone, or an iPad. There's so many choices these days. I don't know, is there anything more traditional than a desktop? No, I don't think so. So those are the options. So there should be a Q&A button somewhere on your screen. Feel free to press that and ask questions as we go through this presentation, because we will get to them at the end. And then we can answer all of those. And obviously, Natalie here, who we will introduce closer, has a lot of great answers, I'm sure. We had Natalie at one of our events in London this year, and obviously had a great bunch of intended parents there, and Natalie was great with answering questions and all that. So I'm sure we can make that happen. And it's all anonymous, even though we could potentially see your names, nobody else can, just so you know. So really take this opportunity to ask Natalie the questions you want to. And if you're looking at this afterwards as a recording, feel free to reach out to Natalie or me, of course. We'll share the information at the end of how you can do that. So even if you're not here live with us today, then you can actually reach out as well. So feel free to do so if you have any questions to any of us. All right, we're going to get started a little bit here, and then we can see how this all goes. So this is always the fun part, wondering if everybody can see this, but I'm hoping that they can. Natalie looks happy with it at least, so that's great. All right, so we're going to just jump in here quickly and look at today's schedule. So we're going to have about 30 minutes speaking about this topic or these topics, and then we're going to do a bit of a Q&A depending on how many questions we have, but we're not going to run anywhere longer than 30, 45 minutes depending on the questions that we have at hand. So we'll do a short introduction. Basically, we've started that one. I'm going to speak shortly about Hatch and PFCLA, not much because we want to focus on the topic at hand, but just give you a little bit of information of who are we and what do we do and who am I as their representative. Shortly about Natalie Gamble, who is a lovely woman we have on here, and her law firm called NGA Law. So Natalie is going to take care of that. And we're going to talk a little bit about surrogacy law, but it's really just going to be an overview. Basically, I want to show you a map of the United States. I'm sure you know how that looks, but it also shows you some good information on how do surrogacy laws look like, or kind of like the availability of surrogacy in the US? What makes it different in different states? And is there anything I need to consider having a surrogate in one state versus another? So we'll talk very briefly about that. And then we're going to kick the ball over to Natalie, who's going to speak about the legal considerations for British or UK intended parents pursuing surrogacy in the United States. So that's going to be what we're mainly going to focus on, because that's the important topic of the day. All right, so a brief introduction of us. I'm Edwin. I'm the international manager here at Hatch, which is our agency. I'm also the international manager of PFCLA, just to make my job more interesting, which is our in-house clinic. I'm also, more importantly, a two-time father to surrogacy and egg donation. Like many of you, I'm assuming, given the topic of this webinar today, you are also in Europe, which also I am. So that's where our international office is, and that's also where I live. So I've been through that journey as a European intended parent. So if there's any questions on my journey, I actually have 2 under my belt, like I mentioned. Feel free to reach out about that. Nothing's too private. It comes with the job to not be too private about your own journeys. So I'm totally fine to share anything you want to know, because sometimes it's hard if you don't know anybody that's been through surrogacy or egg donation for that matter. It's a lot of research on your own, but I really want you to feel like there's somebody to ask, even if it's more personal. And Natalie, we're going to introduce you a bit later, but please go ahead and kind of go through here a little bit of who you are.
Sure. So I'm a UK solicitor, and as Edwin has said, I run a law firm called NGA Law, which was the UK's first fertility law firm. I also came into this through a personal background. I've got 2 kids who are now adults, 22 and 18, who I conceived with my same-sex partner. So we had a different kind of family structure, and that's how I got interested in this area of law in the first place. And with my business partner, Helen, I run two organisations, so NJ Law and also Brilliant Beginnings, which is a non-profit surrogacy organisation, which in part does a lot of work around campaigning and kind of leading the community here in the UK in terms of surrogacy law reform. So I can say more about all of that, but just to kind of give you that flavour that this is something I'm really passionate about, and I'm really pleased to be here this evening. So thank you.
Yeah, wonderful. We definitely want to hear more about your experience. And I remember when you were at the London event and we were starting to kind of look into a little bit of who should come, it was very clear for us that you were the right person given your experience. But I'm sure everybody wants to hear more about that in a bit as well. I saw we have a question. Just keep them coming, even if we don't want to be rude, but just kind of go ahead and we will get to them at the end if that's okay. So as we go through this, just put them in there. I promise you we'll get to them later. Perfect. Then we know a little bit of who we are here and who's speaking to you, you all here. So I'm going to just shortly introduce a little bit about Hatch, our agency, and PFCLA, just very briefly to give you a little bit of understanding of who we are. Hatch is our egg donation and surrogacy agency. So that's where we do those parts. Everything that's non-medical, basically, we do at Hatch. That includes, of course, finding a donor or a surrogate for those who need those services. Egg donation, we actually been doing since 1991, surrogacy almost equally long. So we've been around for over 30 years doing egg donation and surrogacy, which is quite amazing, especially for me, who's 35 years of age. I was basically 2 years of age when this agency was created, which is just mind-baffling. We take care of other parts as well with our partners. For example, legal. Let's say in the US, we have top US attorneys that we work with. They are independent from us for, in our opinion, ethical reasons. They should represent the intended parents and the surrogate, of course, different representation, but independently from the agency. So we don't want to be their employer in that sense. We want them to have everybody to have independent advice, but we do run kind of the cost through our program. And then we also work with lovely people like Natalie locally. We have clients for over 52 countries so far and counting. So we work with lovely attorneys locally like Natalie in the UK, for example, and other countries around the world to make sure we cover that important aspect, which is, the domestic for international intended parents, the domestic part of the journey. And then all of that insurance coordination, which, this is a journey with a lot of people involved, a lot of moving parts. So just coordinating all of that is also Hatch's responsibility. And PFCLA, I'm sure if you are in need of an IVF clinic or if you've been through IVF, you know what a clinic does. Everything medical that has to do with the IVF process of embryo creation, embryo transfers, etc., screening, everything is done at the clinic. And then this combination is quite unique in the US. So most agencies do not have a clinic in-house. So we wanted to create this program because we thought the intended parents need a bit more of peace of mind in their journeys. So what does that even mean? It means that the coordination here is done with one team in one place. So it kind of eases that initial phase of getting to know another clinic or another agency and communicating well together, having the same standards, etc. We also wanted to create that for financial reasons because we wanted people to be able to have a better transparency and insight into the finances of surrogacy, especially. So just making that more transparent with the fixed fee for agency and clinic was also something we did when we created the Peace of Mind program, which we call it. And lastly, to not get too long, is the medical aspects that agencies don't have doctors in-house. So what usually happens is when the medical records review is done, etc., it's usually done with a non-IVF physician or even a non-medical staff overall. But here we want to make sure we do that before the actual match of a surrogate with an intended parent, so we can really make sure that she's medically qualified to go through the journey. So those are kind of the key three aspects. So that's a little bit about Hatch and PFCLA and how we kind of laid the land to complete this journey with all of our lovely intended parents. And a little bit of numbers, which we mentioned most of them here about our experience, number of countries. We do have the largest egg donor database in the United States. So for you looking at egg donors, there is a great selection. You can actually register cost-free on our website, no strings attached, and have a look. Success rates, we basically look at when you start to work with Hatch, when you leave the program one day, did you leave with the baby or without the baby? It doesn't look at timeline exactly or number of embryo transfers, which is more medical, but it looks at did you have a baby at the end? And number of journeys completed and all of that. So just a little bit of background information to not bore you too much on this lovely Thursday evening. The same goes with the clinic. You'll have this in the recording as well to have a look at the number of births at PFCLA, our clinic. I'm a bit biased towards this clinic, I always admit and say, because my two kids are born through this clinic and with the assistance of this clinic. So it always, warms my heart to speak about PFCLA. But I think the numbers also speak for themselves. You can have a look here about, success rates with the donor surrogacy cycle, about our experience of cycles, etc. So just a little bit of information there. Perfect. Okay, so Natalie, now we want to hear more about your amazing work and all of the pioneering work you've done in this field. So please go ahead and introduce a little bit about yourself and what you do so far.
Sure. So, I mean, I've said about a little bit about this already, but I'm a lawyer here in the UK, and my team and I really help with all aspects of the surrogacy process. Um, so, I don't. Can I control the slides, or are you?
And but let me know if you want to
Yeah,
do
that one would be
this.
great.
Yes.
So yeah, so we I've been doing international surrogacy cases since 2008. That was my very first international surrogacy case, and that was the very first international surrogacy case for UK parents who went overseas and then came back and got their parentage secured in the UK. So we've kind of been involved in this right from the very beginning. And since then, I think we've just tipped over 2,000 surrogacy cases that we've now done. So lots and lots of families. And because this is our focus, this isn't kind of just one bit of work that we do alongside other areas of family law or other areas of law in general. So we really do help families with everything that they need. So we do legal advice, we do wills, we do parental order applications or other kinds of applications if you don't qualify for a parental order. And we also help with travel issues, British nationality, and UK passports as well. So it's a very much kind of, this is our focus. And we set up Brilliant Beginnings, which is our sibling organisation, just 11 years ago now, as a kind of a sibling organisation to the law firm, because there were lots of clients coming to us needing kind of additional help. So we help with supporting safe, ethical surrogacy, both here in the UK, but also with the US pathway as well. And we also do lots of campaigning through Brilliant Beginnings as well. So with our legal work, we've kind of moved the law forward with getting inclusion for different family forms. So I argued in favour of including same-sex parents in the law in 2008 successfully. And then we had a case in 2016, which brought single parents under the law as well. So we've kind of gradually expanded things. And we've been kind of pushing for better law in the UK. I'm going to talk a bit more in a minute about how frustrating the law can be. So we've kind of forged a path through it, but it could definitely be better. So we will keep kind of pushing to try and make things smoother here in the UK. And we've also kind of been leaders for our community when difficult times have happened. So when COVID broke out and people couldn't get to their babies because of travel restrictions, we helped with kind of finding ways through the system. And with the Ukraine war as well, parents having babies born there, we've helped to rescue a lot of those babies as well and get them out of that situation. So this is what we live and breathe, and we absolutely love doing it.
I think that's a good point, because in my experience going through this the first time, I didn't really know that the law firm could do so much other things on the side of surrogacy or family law, or just like surrogacy per se, because family law is a broad area, I assume. So I think that's kind of important to kind of note that when you're focused fully on that versus having that as one part of your business, then it might be different. I mean, obviously your numbers speak for themselves. When you focus on this, you reach these kind of numbers. So and leaders in difficult times is just like a great thing, of course. Like I can imagine those scenarios must be horrible for those intended parents. I'm sure they really needed that support, and it's amazing that you were able to be there for that as well.
Yeah, no, we love it, but yeah, it's important, I think, to have people that are really immersed in it and they can see how everything connects and they're not just kind of dealing with one piece of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, perfect. All right. So I'm going to speak a little bit about a U.S. surrogacy law by state. And once again, we're not going to go in depth. We don't have the time with that. So we just want to show a little bit of, people come and ask us a lot about, is it true that one state can differ from another in the U.S., that there's different considerations based on, my civil status or things like that. So that's true. And I want to show you just a little bit of a map here of how that looks. So there are basically three different categories to kind of loosely categorize this in. So we have the surrogacy friendly states, we have the kind of cautionary states, and then we have the restricted or prohibited states where surrogacy is illegal, basically. So what makes a state surrogacy friendly is that those states usually expressly permit surrogacy by either statute or case law, or they have no law prohibiting surrogacy, but there is a legal process in place to kind of take care of the parental establishment process. So that includes a lot of different states in the US, for example, California, of course. California has always had a reputation, fairly so, to be like the best state for surrogacy. But actually, there are many, many great states for surrogacy, including, Washington, Colorado. There's a lot of them, basically, which you can see in the deep green ones here. Then there's a bit of states that we kind of call cautionary states. They present kind of potential legal obstacles and require additional legal processes depending on the specific situations. Sometimes surrogacy can still be practiced there, but it might not be as smooth or predictable what the results will be, for example, parental establishment, etc. And then we have actually 2 states, well, still 3 until the change occurs. I'm alone in my office, so my lights went out. Let me just wave, because this situation of being alone in a dark office is not nice. It always brings me Halloween feelings of, that movie. So there are actually 3 states that still have where it's illegal to pursue surrogacy, which is, these 3 states that we can see here: Nebraska, Louisiana, and Michigan. Actually, Michigan has now changed their law, or they will in early next year, to actually allow for surrogacy. So there's a legal framework in place for that as of next year, I think March 2025. But so that's why we have a little bit of a red circle around Michigan here. So there's many different states to pursue surrogacy, depending on if you are same-sex, married, unmarried, single, etc. Some states might be better, some states may be worse. Our match specialists always make sure to do a legal analysis before we ever match somebody in a state, to make sure that we work with our U.S. attorneys to figure out which ones are the best states for these intended parents. But it can differ a lot. So this is just to give you a little bit of an overview of how that looks, more or less. And why would it differ is basically based on the things that I mentioned. Marital status. Is it, opposite sex, same sex, unmarried, for example? Are you a single male or a single female? Might also have implications. Sometimes there's also implications based on genetic connection, sperm donation, egg donation, embryo donation. And I think this is also very important from Natalie's point of view. I'm sure you're going to speak a little bit about this, genetic link to a baby with UK citizenship, etc. So there is a couple of things to consider. So with your match specialist at an agency, work closely with them to make sure you're matching in a great state that fits your situation specifically. Perfect. All right. So like I said, quick run through and not a lot of time spent there, but we obviously have great attorneys in the US in addition to local countries. So if you do want to go deeper inside of that, we do offer consultations with our attorneys in the US that we work with, if you are interested in doing that. So reach out to me and we can also set that up, of course. But now I want to hand it over to Natalie to speak about what we are all here for. Speaking about this UK law for US surrogacy, what to consider, what to keep in mind, and how it all works. So Natalie, it's a bit annoying to let me know when, the slides should move forward, but just let me know and I'll do that when you're done with the slide.
No problem at all. So yeah, I mean, we're working with parents from the UK every day who are choosing the US for surrogacy. So it's a common decision to make. And I thought it might be helpful just to start with that kind of context. Because unlike many other European countries, surrogacy is legal in the UK and it's possible to do it here at home. And I think a lot of parents, if they could do it locally, would, do that as their first choice. But I think it's really important to understand that in the UK, the process of surrogacy is very long, it's very informal, and it's very uncertain. And that's why parents choose to go to the US, because in the States, you can access predictable timeframes. So you can engage an agency like Hatch that can give you a realistic sense of how long it's going to take to match with a surrogate. Whereas here in the UK, you don't know whether you might match next week or maybe never. But certainly the timeframes are much longer because there's much fewer surrogates here in the UK. Parents also choose the US because of the experienced professional support and this sense that you can rely on other people to help manage the journey and help advise you and guide you through the process rather than having to manage it yourselves. And then lastly, you have legal certainty. So when you go to the States, you can enter into an agreement with your surrogate, which means that you will be recognised as your child's legal parents throughout the process. And for lots of parents from the UK, that feels much more certain and much less anxiety provoking than entering into an informal arrangement in the UK with that kind of risk that, however remote, that the surrogate might change her mind. So when you look at the statistics, you can see, if you look at the numbers of parental order applications which are made, this is, following the births of children through surrogacy, and you go back over the last 10 years, just under half of children are being born in the UK, but 24% are being born in the US. So the US is by a very long distance the most popular international surrogacy destination. The balance, so that remaining 27%, is spread across 38 different countries. So lots of kind of people moving from place to place and surrogacy arrangements happening in small numbers in other places. But you can see from those numbers that the US is a very established international surrogacy destination. And certainly in our experience, it's, very safe and very ethical. And that's why so many parents choose it.
Yeah. Perfect.
So.
Yeah.
So just looking at the kind of comparison of the law, as I was talking about, in the US, you're going to be your child's legal parents throughout the process and from the moment of birth. And that process does vary slightly from state to state, but the kind of core elements of it will usually involve you putting in place a gestational carrier agreement in which you record that intention that you will be the parents. And then there will be a state-specific process of some kind, a legal or an administrative process, in order to validate that agreement you've put in place. And having followed that process, you can then be recorded as the parents on your child's US birth certificate. So from the US side of things, the legal framework is kind of very upfront, it's very clear, very transparent, and you get where you need to be by the time your child is born. Unfortunately, UK law is a bit slower, so it takes a little longer to catch up with that because UK law doesn't recognise the process that you're following in the States. So from a UK perspective, your surrogate and her spouse will be your child's legal parents. As illogical as that may seem, if they have no biological connection and no intention to be parents, and they're not parents in their own country, but that is what UK law says. So for UK parents, there is a post-birth process that you need to follow in order to make you your child's legal parents here as well as in America, and in order to make your child a British citizen if either of you is British. And for most parents, the way that they do that is to apply for a parental order, which is a UK court order made by the family court after your child is born. I haven't got time to go into all the detail this evening, but there are other routes that are possible if that isn't available to you. And the most common scenario for that is single mums or any parents conceiving with donor eggs and donor sperm, where you can't apply for a parental order. So we've now had a very small number of cases where people have applied for adoption or other orders. So if you don't fall into the what I'm about to talk about in more detail, then please do reach out and I can explain the kind of the other ways of doing things. Can I have the next slide, please?
Yeah.
Thank you. So in terms of travel, and obviously this is one of the questions we often get asked, well, how do I bring my baby back to the UK? So you want to kind of have your legal plan being quite strategic. So for most parents, the US passport is the quickest and easiest route to get home. And that's usually available within a few weeks of the birth. It's very straightforward to get. And when you arrive in the UK, your child will be admitted, even if they don't have a British passport, but you need to be prepared for that conversation at the border and carry the right documents and so on. And for most parents, it's easiest to then apply for the parental order and wait for that process to be complete before you apply for your UK passport, because the process of applying is much more straightforward if you do it at that stage. But there are some parents that want to apply earlier, or perhaps aren't applying for a parental order, or for any other reason need their child to be British at birth. And it's important to say that if that applies to you, then it may affect your choice of match, because you may need to choose a surrogate with a particular marital status, or to choose who's going to be the biological father if you're a same-sex couple, if one of you is British but one of you isn't. So this is where that kind of strategic planning comes in terms of it's good to know all this stuff at the start. So if there are choices to be made, you've got control over those choices. Next slide.
Yeah, and I know also, Natalie, which is maybe obvious, that you also offer those kind of consultations that intended parents can speak to you, and you prefer to do that early on so you can kind of get all that under kind of agreement so that they know what they're doing.
Yeah, definitely. It's always good to advise early, because then we've got the kind of maximum scope for options. And, if things are going to make a difference to your journey, you want to know that right at the start. So we typically work with parents with kind of early advice. And then often, we don't necessarily hear from you for a while, and then you'll reach out and say, we're pregnant, what do we do next? And we love that when we get to see the other side of it then.
That's the best part.
Yeah, definitely.
All right.
So I wanted to flag as well, just for any of you who've got other nationalities as well, and we work with many, many families who have multiple nationalities, and just to say that there isn't any international harmonisation of law on surrogacy. So you can never assume that if you've secured your legal status in one place, that it will be recognised somewhere else. So, sometimes we get parents saying to us, oh, we're thinking about whether we should follow the process in the UK or in Germany, let's say. And I think it's important to stress that it's not necessarily a choice of one or the other. If you want to be recognised as parents, or for your child to have nationality status in any country with which you're connected, you need to look at what the law says in that country. So, quite often we're working with parents following multiple legal processes, which can be frustrating. But again, it's all part of the planning. And in other countries, it may be really significant whether your surrogate is married or not married. It may be significant what the order looks like, and therefore what state you want to be matched in, and how those legal documents are drafted. So coming back to that, gather all this information at the start so that you can have the smoothest journey and you make the best choices to make sure that it works for you depending on your particular situation. So just to talk through the parental order process. So this is the kind of typical process for parents to follow. It is a court application that's made to the family court after your child is born, and it will be heard in any international surrogacy case by a high court judge. So these are judges who are quite rigorous, quite formal, but also very supportive and very friendly, and they deal with a lot of surrogacy cases. So you will be asked to file detailed evidence, so explaining your story, your background, how you meet all the various criteria that I'll talk through in a minute. And you have to file a court bundle that assists the judge with kind of gathering all that information. There is also a welfare assessment that's carried out by a social worker as part of the process. It's very light touch, and these social workers work for the court system. So they do understand that this is your child. This is not a child that's being placed with you for adoption. But the court has an obligation to consider the child's welfare in any application that concerns children. So that's kind of part of the process. In terms of the timescales, you're expected to start the application process within the 6 months after the birth. You can now apply late in some circumstances, but it's best just to kind of crack on and get going with it. And the process itself takes about 5 to 9 months to get to a court hearing. And what you want to do is to provide the judge with enough information and enough clarity to make sure that at that court hearing that he or she can make a final order and that the application's not going to drag on any longer. But sometimes the judges set things up so that the hearings are tentative, so they can review what you've filed, and if they don't have enough information, then they'll list further hearings. But as long as you've done your homework well and you've provided all that information, that court hearing should be a celebratory occasion where you can have photographs taken. And sometimes we have clients bring all of their wider family and everybody dresses up, and it's very sweet. And they can be very moving. And, you know, particularly if you've had a long journey to kind of get to that point where, you know, a judge in the UK is saying, you know, you're done, you're finished, you're now the parents, you can just get on with it, can feel, you know, a very nice acknowledgement.
Absolutely.
And then ultimately, once you finish that legal process, your child will be issued with a UK birth certificate, which will record you as the parents, or if you're a single parent, just you. And that's your insurance policy, if you like, against any future difficulties in the UK. That establishes you're the parents here. You can apply for school places and medical care and all the things that you need to do as parents.
Yeah, I can imagine that is a very, very touching kind of time. I mean, I don't know, in where I live, you know, that court kind of final hearing doesn't really happen. So, but I can really see, obviously you're excited and, you know, happy about coming to the end of sometimes quite a long journey. Even, you know, with the best journeys, the most smoothest ones, there's still, you know, anywhere from 1.5 to 2 year process, if not longer sometimes. So I can just imagine that, you know, gathering your family in the final hearing and getting that kind of done must be a very emotional and happy time. So hopefully we can have all intended parents from the UK well prepared with your assistance to also make sure that that homework is done, like you say, so that they can just focus on the celebration and being done with this long and rewarding, but still long journey in many ways.
Definitely. And I have to confess, I mean, however many hundreds of these hearings I've done, I still get quite emotional because you can see, you know, our parents very often get quite tearful. Sometimes the judges get quite emotional as well. And it is, yeah, they're lovely things to do. It's a real privilege.
Yeah, it's amazing. All right.
Super. So in terms of what the court's assessing, so these are slightly meatier applications than the kind of court applications you make in the US, where it's very much about have you followed the procedure and is there a contract and so on. With the UK application, there's a list of criteria that the judge has to assess. So first of all, you have to have a biological connection with your child. It doesn't need to be with both of you if you're a straight couple. You can use typically donor eggs or donor sperm, but you need one of you to have that biological connection. You need to be over 18, there's no maximum age, and you, or if you're making a joint application, one of you needs to be domiciled in the UK. Just to flag that domicile can be a bit trickier than it seems. So if you're from somewhere else originally, you'll need to establish that you've got the intention to make the UK your permanent home, and the judges typically want quite a lot of information to substantiate that. Equally, we do quite a lot of applications for British parents who are not living in the UK, but you can still establish a domicile here if you've got connections with the UK. So it's quite a fluid concept, or one to watch if you've got international connections. And then you can make the application as a single parent, or you can apply jointly. If you're jointly, you either need to be married, civil partners, or living as partners in an enduring family relationship. So that's all the criteria in relation to you guys. Can you have the next slide, please?
Yeah, sorry.
No worries. So for the surrogate, and if she's married, then her spouse as well, they both need to consent to the parental order being granted. That consent is separate from the US legal process. So she has to separately agree to the parental order being granted, and the consent has to be given more than 6 weeks after the birth. So the idea is that she has this cooling off period before she gives that consent to surrendering her legal parenthood permanently. And there are various procedural requirements that you have to follow in terms of serving her with the application and getting her to sign forms and so on. So we can kind of help with all of that and what needs to be done. But typically with US surrogacy cases, it's really straightforward because the surrogates speak English, they're well educated, we can communicate, by email, and it's very easy to get documents notarized and so on. So it's usually a very easy part of the process. We then have to ask the court to authorise the payments that have been made. And just to explain that this goes back to the fact that the legislation was written in such a way in 1990 to try and discourage people from entering into commercial surrogacy arrangements. The law doesn't make commercial surrogacy illegal for parents. You can pay and there's no breach of the law. But the judge, before transferring parenthood to you, has to consider what's been paid. And if more than expenses has been paid, they have to authorise those payments. So we've had a whole load of case law develop around, how does the court exercise that discretion? And going back to that kind of case I mentioned, that was the very first one, I remember feeling quite uncertain about how the court was going to deal with this, because, if you've got an international surrogacy case that's very transparently a commercial arrangement, does that mean that they can't authorise the payments? But these days, the courts have been authorising commercial surrogacy cases for 15 years or more now, and there's never been a case where they've refused an order because of what was paid. So it is a very kind of routine part of the process. But in order for the judge to kind of square the circle of the law in the way it's written, they will need quite detailed information about the payments you've made. So typically with the US surrogacy case, we would get hold of a copy of your escrow account, and we can use that to pull out to show the judge what was paid to your surrogate, which bits were for her expenses and loss of earnings and insurance and so on, which bits were the pregnancy compensation that need to be authorised. They also look at the payments to the agency as well. So I'm looking at kind of your agency fees and so on. And then the court will authorise those payments if they are satisfied that you as the parents have acted in good faith and that your surrogate was not exploited or taken advantage of. And again, this is one of the big advantages of going to somewhere like the US and to a kind of reputable agency like Hatch, where, there's proper screening processes to make sure that no one is being exploited or taken advantage of. Everybody has independent legal advice. There's a clear legal process to follow. And the courts will want to kind of see that you've done all of those things in order to make sure that this is essentially an ethical surrogacy arrangement.
Yeah.
And then lastly, there is the welfare of your child. So I mentioned about the kind of light touch social work assessment. The court is looking at welfare, but in that very kind of light way where they do recognise that this is your child that you have chosen to conceive. But one of the issues that comes up quite commonly is the court will ask parents about what they intend to tell their child in the future about how they came into the world, what information you have about any egg donor and any surrogate, and what your plans are to stay in touch if that's possible. And it's not that there's necessarily a right or wrong answer to that, but they want to know that you've thought about it and that you're going to approach it in a child-focused way. So it's just something to be aware of.
Yeah, that's interesting because that question is asked quite a lot to us on the agency side of, what do I tell my child? What is right? What is wrong? And, also, what did you do in terms of my own experience?
Yeah.
Just like you said, the right answer is that, there is no right or wrong answer, but obviously, being transparent and everything is known here when it comes to the journey. It's very transparent in the US with the good established agency. So our kind of general opinion might be, openness with your child for that, but it is a tough question for sure. So it's great that it's asked at that time because it is something that's definitely worth considering when, how, all of that stuff. So it's not...
And I think also kind of what language to use. I think that's where parents sometimes struggle with, when do I start talking? How do I bring this up? How do I talk about it in a way that's going to be child focused? And I think parents that are nervous about having those conversations, they're worried about introducing information that isn't age appropriate, or maybe it'll unsettle a child, or, and I think, my experience as, a parent as well, is that kids are incredibly accepting of what you tell them. And, that they don't have the same kind of baggage, I guess, as adults have. And that you just need to answer their questions and give them confidence that it's okay to ask more. And I think just kind of drip feeding that information in a really kind of positive way helps children feel really secure. I think what we don't want is family secrets that are going to cause, rifts or difficulties in relationships further down the line.
Exactly, especially when we do have all that information available, which makes it even more reasonable to just kind of do it that way. So I agree.
Yeah.
Great.
Super. So is UK law changing? So this is something that if any of you have kind of been researching and interested in this, there was quite a lot of noise over the last few years in the media about this kind of move to reform UK law. And that came about because the Law Commission undertook a project to make recommendations to the government about bringing UK surrogacy law up to date. So it was a project that started in 2018. It got delayed because of COVID, and the final report was published in March of 2023. Now, the Law Commission recommendations are just recommendations, so it doesn't mean that there's a bill in Parliament or that there's any kind of obligation for the government to take this forward. And I think it's important to say that that this report was published under the previous government. They didn't respond to say that they were going to take it forward. And obviously now we've got a new government with lots of other priorities. So at the moment, there is no timescale for when this might happen, and it might not happen at all. But just to run through the recommendations really quickly, the Law Commission has recommended a new pathway for some UK surrogacy cases. And this is kind of what caught all the headlines, that parents could be legal parents on their child's birth certificate. But I just wanted to stress that it's not going to transform surrogacy in the UK overnight, because they've also recommended tightening up what UK surrogates can be paid even more than the restrictions that are there at the moment. So it's unlikely to improve the shortages of UK surrogates. And they've also recommended that surrogates in the UK retain the right to change their mind after the birth. So again, it's not going to address that issue of the lack of legal certainty that is one of the big things that drives parents overseas. So my view certainly is that even if this reform happens, which I don't think is particularly likely in any foreseeable timescale, I think the things that are encouraging parents to go to the US for surrogacy are going to remain completely unchanged. And in terms of law reform for parents going overseas, very sadly, the Law Commission has not recommended any significant reform at all. So it will still be necessary to go through that parental order process that I have described. So sorry not to share better news on all of that. But we will keep pushing and keep trying. So we will get there eventually, I'm determined.
Yeah, well, you've changed a lot already, it seems. So, we're rooting for you, and we believe that you can make it happen for sure. All right.
So just we've talked about this already, really, but just in terms of how we can help. So we often give legal advice at the planning stages, really just to help you get your UK legal strategy set, so you know what's coming, you make the best choices, and you can do the right things at the right time. We help with parental order applications and different levels of service depending on the help that you need. We help with British nationality and passports, wills, and I wanted to do a final plug for our campaign for surrogacy law reform, that we are always kind of, if you're interested in these issues and they affect you personally, do write to your MP, say that the law here needs to be improved, especially since we've got a whole new bunch of MPs in Parliament that haven't probably come across this issue before. So there's lots of information on the Brilliant Beginnings website about surrogacy law reform if you're interested in that as well.
Perfect. Yeah. Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you so much for walking us through that, Natalie. I'm sure it's, when I did my first surrogacy journey, even second, actually, I've never had a chance to listen to an attorney from my own home country speak about this. So I'm sure that those listening in or watching this recording afterwards or coming across this on our YouTube channel, they would love this information. So really big thanks for that. And we have some ways to reach out to Natalie here and her team. We also have that here. So now we're going to answer your questions. But like Natalie said, and I mentioned before, you can absolutely set up a call with any of us to discuss these topics. If it's more legal, obviously UK, Natalie is, if not obvious already, the right woman to do so with. If it's more about the agency side, matching, surrogacy, egg donation, our services, you can reach out to hatch.us. You can fill out the form and you'll be sent the right way, most likely to me. And then you can also scan the QR code if you're good at that. I'm like a 80-year-old grandfather with those kind of things. I'd never make it happen. But if you manage to scan it, you'll be taken to my calendar. You can also do that there. You can save it in your kind of bookmark or whatever if you want to look at it later. All right. Well, Natalie, are you ready for some questions?
I am.
Wonderful. All right. So we have a question about, can both males have a baby with both genes? So not so much legal, maybe more
Yeah.
more medical. So a same-sex couple cannot have a baby with sharing genes from both fathers, if I put it that way. So there's absolutely a way to create embryos with genetic links to each father, but there's nothing like the infamous swirl, which I think comes from the show Modern Family, where somebody claims to have done that with their same-sex partner, and now their baby is, genetically linked to both of them, which in that series is a joke later because the child is obviously connected more to one of the parents than the other one. So that doesn't exist. Usually what same-sex couples do is that when we retrieve the eggs with PFCLA, for example, of an egg donor, we split those 50-50, and then we fertilize those with different semen sources of each father. And we create embryos that are genetically linked to each father, basically. And then what people usually do, that gay couples might have, for example, 2 kids in their before they're done with their family building, and maybe kind of try to prioritize one genetic link from one person and then the other person. And some couples don't care at all about that. So that's not possible, but as close as we can get, I guess, which is not very close to make that happen, but that's how it usually works.
Yeah, and I've certainly worked with so many gay families where they've had a biological child each, but with a shared egg donor. And sometimes in situations where they know it's one each, but they don't know which is which. And we can kind of make that work with the UK legal process as well, if
Okay,
that's what
that's
you want to do.
interesting. Yeah, that's interesting to know. Here is a legal question, though. Well, legal cost question. Roughly, how much should we budget in the legal cost on the UK side? Which I think is a very fair question to understand the total costs.
Definitely. And I think it's really important, if you budget for nothing else, to have that initial legal advice at the beginning, because that will give you that really kind of clear steer and make sure that you set things up in the right way. And we charge £700 plus VAT for a legal review meeting, where we'll spend an hour or two with you and talk through your personal situation in a lot of detail, and then write to you as well, confirming that advice. From there, it's very much kind of your choice as to how much you spend on legal costs. There is a whole court process to go through. The only fee that you can't avoid is the court fee, which is £255. But really, the choice from there is about how much support you want with legal representation for that process. So we have 2 different fixed fee services that we offer. So a premium representation service for parents that just want us to take care of everything and do the passport application as well. And we have a basic representation as well, where we work a little bit more in tandem with you to reduce the cost, where we're still representing you, but you're doing some of the legwork to help keep the costs down. So there's lots of different options. We also work with parents who are representing themselves, where we're just kind of helping behind the scenes with advice. So don't feel like you're kind of on the hook. I mean, in terms of budget, you can look from anything from a few £100s up to £20,000 plus. So but we're always very clear about kind of those options so that you can budget to the level of support that you want to have.
Yeah, great. So I have another one for you that is illegal, but I'm just going to jump in quickly and take this one about how much you should expect for a whole process and for the cost. So this is a bit of a difficult question. Absolutely, in the US, where there are hundreds of surrogacy and egg donation agencies, everybody offering different things. There are basically 2 models in the US, very briefly. It's a variable model where you kind of pay as you go. Not every cost is fixed, and you will potentially avoid some costs, but if they do occur, you will be liable for all of them. Or there is the fixed fee model, which Natalie kind of mentioned for their own services, exists for agencies as well, where it's more fixed. But don't be fooled and think that a fixed fee covers exactly the same things every time, because every agency and clinic, they will cover different things even within a fixed fee. So let's say, for example, with the Hatch program, you could have anything from $160,000 fixed fee up towards $230,000 fixed fee, depending on what services you need. Surrogacy only, surrogacy with egg donation. Are you using your own eggs or oocytes, or do we need an egg donor, and everything in between? And all of our programs also cover the IVF part of things. So there's a big range, and there's an even bigger range if you take out just like the fixed fee programs and you go to these variable programs. There's no guarantee of how that will exactly look in the end, but they try to give you like a good estimate. So it's a really tough kind of cookie to kind of answer here, but that's the kind of broad range, at least if you look at Hatch, for example, from 160 for surrogacy up towards 230 for egg donation, surrogacy, and IVF altogether. We also have an a la carte egg donation program, if we put it that way, where we just use an egg donor with us, so we can discuss those costs as well, but that's kind of the rough numbers that you're looking at.
Yeah, it's really important, isn't it, with budgeting to make sure that you've got everything on the list that needs to be. So that even your own travel and accommodation, insurance costs for your surrogate and your newborn as well, and just making sure you know what's in any fee that you're being quoted by the agency and what you need to budget for on top of that.
Yes, that's a really, really tough part. And, just personally, my first journey myself had a variable plan. I thought that everything was kind of more or less, going to act out that way. A lot of things happen, which they do sometimes. If your agency is good, they're going to take care of it. But, things do happen. There's a lot of people involved. So it could be more costly than you might think. So just like you said, Natalie, understanding these small differences, what is included, what isn't, to what extent, is there a cap, under what circumstances. I know it sounds tough, and it is tough, but that's, hopefully you're going to have a great agency to walk you through that. But it is a hard time understanding that, for sure. It's become a little bit easier nowadays, I feel like, since I did my first journey, but it's not guaranteed that there's transparency and predictability. And agencies are unregulated in the US. So don't forget that when it comes to that part. Like, the legal landscape of surrogacy, as you saw on that map, is quite robust and strong. But how the agencies act within that is not as regulated, which we think is sad. It should be highly regulated, hopefully in the future. So be careful with your research. Speak to more than one agency. If it seems too good to be true, it probably is usually what we would say. Okay, so a last legal question, and then we're going to let Natalie and all of you go, because I promised not go too far from our time. So you did mention a little bit about this, but I agree that it could be maybe a little bit more in depth. How difficult is it to obtain a parental order if you are not a UK citizen?
So the test for getting a parental order is not citizenship, it's domicile, and they are different things. So we have represented quite a few parents who are domiciled in the UK but are not UK citizens. So if you're talking about a scenario where, perhaps you're a citizen of another country, you've come to live in the UK, maybe you've got a visa to live here, but you haven't yet naturalized as British, you can still apply for a parental order if you can satisfy the court that you have the intention to make the UK your permanent and indefinite home. So it's much less about your visa and immigration status and much more about why you came to the UK, how you feel about living in the UK, have you put down roots here in terms of, buying a home. It doesn't, not that you have to have bought a home, but just, examples of things to show that you really want to stay for the long term. And we often work with parents who, have come to the UK because it's a friendlier place to raise their family, particularly if they're same-sex parents or a single parent, than whatever home country that they've come from. So, if there are kind of things like that you can talk to the court about in terms of, this is where I see my future, this is where I want to raise my child, this is where I plan to live for the rest of my life, then you can establish a domicile even if you've only just arrived in the UK. So it's not just about citizenship, but it will kind of depend on your particular circumstances.
Great. Wonderful. Well, thank you all for being here, and especially Natalie, thank you for taking time, evening time of yours to be here with us. Like I said, once again, I know it's immensely useful for intended parents to hear this, like I did not the first time around. So a really big thanks, and for everybody being here today, thank you as well. It's been a real pleasure to have you here, and you've asked some great questions. If you're looking at this afterwards, the recording, feel free to reach out if there's any other questions that somebody else didn't ask. We do answer, online within reason, if via email within reason, if the topic is not too complicated, or set up a call with Natalie or me, of course, and then we go really in depth of everything. So I hope you have some good knowledge here. It doesn't matter if you're just researching or you're ready to jump in basically and get started. I hope there was a bit of information for everybody. And yeah, so take care of each other, and have a safe time out there, and we'll hopefully see each other in the future. Thank you again, Natalie, for being here.
My pleasure.